This is Michael Popok, Legal AF. We got a battle between Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, trying to preserve and protect his investigation, criminal investigation, his getting the indictment of Donald Trump on 34 counts. Balance that against the intrusions, the interference, the violations of New York State sovereignty and police powers to investigate its own crime that transpires on its own soil by members of Congress led by Jim Jordan and the Judiciary Committee, who have created a kangaroo court in order to try to drag Alvin Bragg out of his office in the Manhattan DA, across and down to the Congress, in order to testify about an ongoing criminal investigation and the current indictment that is in place against Donald Trump. And while they're along for the ride, let's drag Mark Pomerantz, a former special prosecutor in the office, now retired from the office, and have him appear before this august body of the judiciary to testify again about an ongoing criminal investigation and current indictment of an ex-president about conduct that happened before he was president. And now we're in federal court because Alvin Bragg last week filed an emergency application with a federal judge in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. It's assigned to Judge Mary Kay Vokasil, a Trump appointee, used to be on the bankruptcy court, and there is full briefing going on, filing of papers and briefs by both sides as the judge moves to an April 18th hearing on whether Congress has the power to provide this type of quote-unquote oversight to interfere with a criminal investigation and subpoena at all anyone, because the starting point, before we even get to issues of state sovereignty, state, local, and home rule, state, municipal, and police power, that's all being interfered with and breached by the federal government in a way that the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution did not anticipate, nor did they want to have happen, which is why it's going to end up federal court and ultimately at the U.S. Supreme Court. In order to even get there, you've got to ask yourself, and the judge has to ask yourself the fundamental question: does Congress have a legislative purpose in issuing this subpoena? In other words, does the Judiciary Committee hearing and the committee have oversight over this type of local crime fighting law enforcement event in New York? Yes or no? That is the starting point. It wasn't the starting point for what Jim Jordan's lawyers filed on his behalf today. The starting point for them was, you can't sue me because of the speech and debate clause of the U.S. Constitution. And I'll get there next, but we don't even get there if you can't answer the most fundamental question, is whether this investigation is tied to a legislative purpose. Why? Because the powers of Congress are, of course, limited. Each branch has its own article in the U.S. Constitution, and the article that's reserved for the legislative branch is Article 1, right? Article 2, the president, the executive branch. Article 3, the judiciary. Article 1 and its provisions related to congressional power, nowhere in there is the power to investigate or to provide oversight. It's not an express provision of Article 1, but U.S. constitutional law has established that it is an implied right of Congress to investigate, right, to provide oversight as long as it's tied to a proper legislative purpose. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, even going back to the 1920s, McGraw versus Dougherty, Sinclair versus U.S., has declared that if you don't have a legislative purpose that's proper, that's it, game over. Congress doesn't have the ability to hold a hearing or issue a subpoena. And so hold that thought, because it rounds out in 2020 with a major decision, which Alvin Bragg's office cited in their filing, called Trump versus Mazars. Of course, it's Donald Trump. And he's suing at that time to try to stop the subpoena that the Financial Services Committee, led by Democrats at the time, had issued to Deutsche Bank and Capital One Bank to try to get financial information from Donald Trump, the only president in modern era who's not provided his tax returns at that time. And there was a whole fight about that. Now, the fight there was different. The fight there was between the legislative branch and which was Congress, and the executive branch, because Trump was still president at that time. So it was a live debate. But the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and said, there has to be, firstly, legislative purpose, proper legislative purpose, or we never even get to the subpoena. And usually this is worked out between the branches. But here, in this case of Alvin Bragg versus Jordan, we don't have a separation of powers issue. We have a state sovereignty issue. New York being a sovereign power, one of the 50 states, and its relationship to the federal government and the limitations of the federal government, all other power being reserved to the states by the U.S. Constitution. What the founding fathers and the framers did not want at all, which is why they set up the checks and balance systems of the three co-equal branches of government on the federal side, and the relationship between the federal government and the states, so the states would agree to band together, right? To band together and become not just a confederation, but a united set of states. They didn't want to have to worry about an out-of-control federal government that was some sort of super grand jury or had some sort of super police power, literally, over the citizens of the United States. That's why there's no federal police in that way. There's law enforcement that goes along with certain branches and certain departments, but there's no federales, there's no federal police. That's reserved, police powers generally reserved with the states, as is law enforcement, as is prosecution of local crime, which brings us full circle back to Donald Trump and Alvin Bragg in the Manhattan DA's office. So what is the legislative purpose? Well, when Jim Jordan finally gets around to it in his filing papers, he says, oh, well, we got a couple of things. And the judge is reading this, okay, what are they? Well, he says, one is they spent $5,000 of federal forfeiture funds for part of their investigation in that office 5 years ago. Okay, that's one. That does not create a legislative purpose, that they use some federal funds somewhere for some investigation related to Donald Trump, not even the ones related to Stormy Daniels, which is what Alvin Bragg's office reminded the judge in their original filing. Okay, so what else you got? The judge is going to say when she reads the papers. Well, we may want to create legislation that requires suits like this about ex-presidents to be filed in federal court, not in state court. Okay, what does that have to do with getting information about the ongoing criminal investigation and current indictment, meaning there could be a second or third indictment of Donald Trump coming out of this office? The judge would ask, what does this have to do with that? Because if you don't have that legitimate legislation that could be proposed, then your investigation is a sham, and so is your subpoena, and it'll be quashed. So that was one answer. Well, maybe we'll force that kind of case to be filed somewhere else. What else you got? And then the third argument for proper legislative function has to do with, well, maybe we'll make it so they could state prosecutors can't ever use federal funds for their prosecution. I mean, this is the sham that they have put in writing to try to get the judge to find a legislative purpose. Because if she doesn't find that, game over, game, set, match, over. Then they have the fallback argument, which is, I can't be sued, Jim Jordan's argument, I can't be sued in any court because I'm a legislator and speech and debate. And speech and debate clause of the U.S. Constitution basically says that a legislator doing legislative things, including investigatory, can't be called to account for himself anyplace else other than on the House or Senate floor. But here we're talking about legislative purpose and whether this particular investigation has a proper legislative purpose to allow it to even issue a subpoena. And that is obviously for the courts to decide, the judiciary branch to decide, just as the cases that ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court that I've listed as precedent that's already been used by all the sides here, McGraw versus Dougherty, Sinclair versus U.S., and Trump versus Mazars. They all came out of, ultimately, cases against congresspeople leading investigations that had improper purpose and the court establishing the implied power of Congress, but it's always limited by first having to find legislative purpose. So this is going to be the fight. And just to show you that this is a complete and utter sham investigation that doesn't have proper legislative purpose, let's look for a minute at today's field trip. It was like a 6th grade class trip by Jim Jordan and members of Congress into New York. You know, McCarthy visited the New York Stock Exchange for his little show and tell, and then a whole group of them set up in New York to try to embarrass Alvin Bragg. And they called it the Victims of Violent Crime in Manhattan hearing. The hearing's name alone, and this is where Alvin Bragg's going to use what happened today against them in his filing. The hearing today alone demonstrates the lack of legislative purpose, proper legislative purpose, and that this is merely a political vendetta, retaliation by the MAGA Republicans against a democratically appointed and elected prosecutor who's just doing his job and prosecuting crime, in this case, Donald Trump. How do we know that? Because all they did was drag in a bunch of people who claimed to have been victims of Alvin Bragg's policies because they were the victims of violent crime, as if Alvin Bragg had actually committed the violent crime on them. And Elise Stefanik, and who's running for vice president right now, trying to get Trump to pay attention to her so she can be selected as vice president, and other Republicans, brought in this parade of human props, unfortunately, pawns, being used for political show, political theater, to talk about what happened to them and why bail reform needs to be changed. Well, that's not an Alvin Bragg issue. That's a governor of the state issue. And why crime is up in New York and Alvin Bragg's not doing anything about it. Well, stop right there. First of all, what is the proper federal Congress legislative purpose for talking about crime in any state or jurisdiction, Republican or Democrat? They have no role in that area. They don't provide funding in those areas. They're not supervising crime in those areas. Okay, if they want to pump some money into the policing in America or police reform in America or whatever, they can, but it doesn't mean they get to oversee and provide oversight and hearings to the day-to-day operation of law enforcement and prosecutions in any particular jurisdiction. So this is all Exhibit A that Alvin Bragg is going to use in his filing the next day in front of the judge to say this has nothing to do with proper legislative intent. This is just political show and political theater for the Republicans because they have no legislative purpose in overseeing a local prosecutor who's just doing his job. But it gave them the opportunity to talk about and wrongly cite statistics about in Manhattan, where I'm at right now. The main reason violent crime and other crime went up in New York is because of COVID-19, and the year of and the year after saw a tremendous spike in violent crime in big cities, and New York was no exception to that. So whereas the New York murder rate was historically very low, it doubled because of COVID, the police getting their hands on violent crime, people acting out in ways, criminals acting out in ways historically that they never had, and then the police having to try to play catch up. I mean, you have the same police force size during COVID, before COVID, and after COVID, and they got to deal now with more crazy people and violent criminals doing crazy and violent things. Happened everywhere throughout America. So that's one major rationale for that. But historically, if you look at New York, it is the safest big city in America and has been for a long, long time. In fact, this used to be the murder capital of the world, of America, especially in the 90s. 2,500 people a year were murdered in one of the 5 boroughs of New York. And that number dropped to 280 even during the pandemic. So, there's been an 80 to 90% reduction in murder rate in New York over the last 30 to 40 years. It is the test study. Criminologists, social scientists look at New York as a model on how to fight and reduce not just 1 year over year, but reduce historically and permanently violent crime and murder. So for them, the Republicans to pick out and come to New York and try to embarrass New Yorkers and say, oh, your city's so much more violent, without recognizing what happened during the pandemic, or Alvin Bragg's not doing anything about it. Frankly, Alvin Bragg's numbers are quite good in the last year. Now that he's been in the office for a full year, his violent crime and other types of crime are all trending down, not up. But my discussion about this demonstrates the very thing that kills the Jim Jordan subpoena against Mark Pomerantz and try to interfere with the continued prosecution of Donald Trump, because it's all political. I'm only talking about politics here. This is all politics and local crime. It has nothing to do with Congress. So we're going to follow the filing by Alvin Bragg's office, what the judge is hearing on the 18th, and her decision, her first decision, is there a proper legislative purpose attached to the subpoena and the investigation by the Judiciary led by MAGA Jim Jordan at all? If the answer to that is no, the case is over. The subpoena will be quashed, trying to get Mark Pomerantz and Alvin Bragg to testify. If she finds there is a proper legislative purpose and she allows the subpoena and the testimony to go forward, Alvin Bragg's office will take an emergency appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York Federal, which is primarily more Democratic-centered, and try to get a ruling reversing the lower court's decision. If that ruling goes against Alvin Bragg's office, then they'll have to take an emergency application to the Supreme Court, and they'll go through one of the more Democrat, liberal-leaning justices in order to do that. So that's one good thing. But this could easily be winner or loser on a fast track to the U.S. Supreme Court over the next 30 to 60 days, and we'll keep a close eye on it. I'm Michael Popok. I do hot takes like this about every day on politically charged litigation issues at the intersection of law and politics on the MeidasTouch network. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, I co-anchor the leading podcast devoted to law and politics called Legal AF. And if you like what we're doing here, follow us on the MeidasTouch network, and you can follow me on all things social media at MS Popok. This is Michael Popok, Legal AF reporting.
Hey, Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram at MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.